This is
Make it plain.
Make it plain.
MIP
With Masamela Matfumo.
Mark Thompson.
Make it plain.
Get woke.
God bless you. Good morning. Get woke. Ladies and gentlemen, MIP is COVID free. Free meaning you don't need a subscription to hear MIP every day now for a limited time. While we endure this pandemic, we want to make it available to everyone. So wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Pandora, MIP is COVID free and available to you and everyone without a subscription. Ladies and gentlemen, my very special guest today has a political science degree from Stanford and a Master of Science in Politics and Communication from the London School of Economics. In 2018, she was elected to join the inaugural class of Obama Foundation Fellows, and she joined also in 2015 the inaugural class of Technology and Democracy Fellows at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at the Harvard Kennedy School. She previously worked on the Voting Rights Project for the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. She was the New Organizing Institute's Election Administration Director from 2012 to 2015. Right now, she's leading a team that is doing groundbreaking work to make U.S. elections more inclusive and secure. And she's doing that as Executive Director of the Center for Tech and Civic Life. Tiana Epps-Johnson joins us from Chicago. Tiana, how are you?
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I am hanging in there.
Yeah, we're glad to hear that. Tiana, I was just talking before we got started about how our loved ones are doing and glad that yours are doing okay.
Yeah, as am I.
Yeah, wonderful. So I'm nervous. I think we all are we were nervous before COVID, Tiana. Now we're even more nervous. So tell us what the Center for Tech and Civic Life is doing right now in general to make elections more inclusive and secure. Especially in this current climate.
Yeah. So for us, even before the pandemic, our work has been really laser focused on making sure that folks across the country have the information that they need to be able to meaningfully engage in the voting process and civic engagement year round. And also really focus on making sure that election departments, the government departments that are on the front lines of making sure that our voting experience lives up to what it should, that those folks have the training and tools that they need to be able to run inclusive, professional, trustworthy elections. Since the pandemic, for us, our work has really had the North Star of making sure that our elections this year center both safety of all voters and election workers, but also access. And so that largely has looked like moving into a rapid response mode to be able to prepare a set of trainings and tools for election departments so that they're able to both increase the number of voters that they're serving by mail, while also making sure to have really safe in-person options for voters so that everyone can exercise their right to vote this November.
Clearly, the argument has been that there needs to be greater access and pretty much via mail. People want to push the mail ballot option, obviously, because we don't know whether things are shut down again in November. We know what's already happening in some primary states. Help me though, when we say mail, how do we reconcile snail mail as an option in the context of what you do in terms of high tech? How do those two work together, technology and snail mail?
Right. So, one of the things that we know is that we don't know exactly what November is going to look like, but there's the chance that there may be a second wave of the pandemic. There's a chance that there might be some relaxed stay at home orders, or there might be just some residual impacts where people are more reluctant to congregate in place, and we can expect that in any of those circumstances, it's going to impact the way that people vote. And so the goal is, how do we reduce the number of people that need to congregate at the same pace? How do we reduce crowds at in-person polling places? And as I mentioned, one of the core ways to do that is to increase the number of people who are voting by mail. A pretty analog process, yes, compared to the ways that we're using tech in other parts of our life, but also a really proven process, a process that is used by already in 2018 a third of voters to get their ballot and return it. And a process that really suits us for what's in front of us, right? A need to reduce the number of people actually operating in person. And so the question of how technology intersects here is, what are the ways that we can use technology to make it easier for people to request getting one of those ballots by mail? How can we use technology to make it easier for the election workers on the other side of receiving those ballots to process them and count them in a timely way and get results back out to us? And how can we use technology when people are not able to leave their homes, and when traditional organizers aren't able to run the same field programs to inform and mobilize voters? How can we use technology to make sure that everyone still has access to information about the process and their options? And how can we use technology to make sure that we are making sure that voters are registered and their addresses are up to date, because that also is a critical underpinning, not only for people to be able to participate in the process, but also good addresses are critical to a good vote by mail process.
Yeah. So I presume then that the center is availing itself to jurisdictions. I mean, we know that when it comes to voting, everything is at best state focused, and at worst county focused and localized. So I presume you all are making yourselves available to all jurisdictions for really advice and consultation on how to make all this work, right?
That's right. So one of the challenges with elections in the US is that we have a really decentralized system. Across the 50 states and territories, it looks different based on the state laws that you have in a given place. And that also means that across our states and territories, voters have different experiences with voting by mail, and election officials have different experiences administering elections by mail. So we have states out west, like Colorado and Washington and Oregon, who have a long history of voting or serving all of their voters, or the majority of their voters, by mail. And so those states also have some proven best practices about what it takes to be able to administer an election at scale, primarily by mail, but with also in-person options. But as we look further out east and in the South, really fewer than 10% of voters on average are voting by mail in those states. And so what we're doing at the center, we announced last week that we will be providing 12 trainings to election departments that will be delivering online, which is a method that we have experience with and have proven works to deliver this best practices training. Lifting up what we know are the proven ways that you can administer an accessible election by mail to election officials, training them on those best practices, and then in the coming months following these best practices training, also providing direct implementation support for jurisdictions that might need a little bit more tailored support in implementing these practices.
Well, and that's really where the technology comes in. I mean, now people are at home and we're all doing virtual meetings. So that's a place where technology is applied, obviously, but also just in terms of getting people or getting jurisdictions well organized to get those mail-in ballots out, getting the free postage on them, all those types of things. There's a way to make that analog process run more smoothly technologically, isn't it?
That's right. There are things like high processing mail sorters and scanners that are the type of technology that really underpin a successful vote by mail process, right? There's technology that helps with the verification of signatures, which is one of the core ways that you're able to make sure that a mail ballot that's returned was submitted by the voter that it was sent to in the first place. And so, yes, in the back end of all of these pretty manual paper-based processes are technology that makes it easier for election officials to handle the volume, but also makes the work itself more accurate and more effective.
And you mentioned some of the states that still seem somewhat either behind or, as a matter of fact, resistant to mail ballots. Where do you guys come in on that? Do you still do outreach and say, hey, why don't y'all think about this? This might work, or just how do you all handle that?
Yeah, at the center, we have traditionally stayed away from doing direct advocacy. There's amazing organizations that are doing direct policy advocacy work. There's amazing organizations that are a part of this ecosystem that are doing really important litigation. For us, we are focused on, once you are past the point of passing policy, you need to implement the laws on the books in a way that ensure the greatest amount of access for your voters and in a way that is professional and secure. And so that's where we come into the process. When you have a law on the books, how can you make it so it best centers the voter and works well for the diversity of folks that you might serve in your community? Mm-hmm. Now, when it comes to what we're facing, though, with the pandemic, it's very clear that there's a minimum set of rules that election departments should have that are available to all voters. And one thing that's clear is that any voter that would like to vote by mail this November should have the opportunity to do that. Okay. And it's also clear that if a voter, because they either have poor or no mail service, or if a voter needs language access assistance, or if a voter has a disability where it makes the most sense for them to be able to vote independently with the machines that are available at an in-person polling location, that those diversity of options are available so that all voters have the ability to cast a meaningful ballot this fall.
Yeah. We also know too, Tiana, that some of the legislation that has been introduced would provide funds for jurisdictions to make ready for a mail-in balloting process. So when you were talking about some of the technology that makes mail-in balloting smoother and more successful, I mean, that's where some of that money would go. And is that very expensive? I mean, when people are talking about doing this, is that one of the challenges for jurisdictions? Does that kind of stuff cost a lot more money?
I'm so happy that you brought up the issue of funding, because that's one of the most critical pieces here. And it's the thing that needs to be acted upon, arguably the most urgently. So experts estimate that nationwide it's going to cost between $1.5 and $2 billion to be able to successfully meet the needs of voters this fall. That is what it's going to cost to ramp up vote by mail operations, and also to make enough options available for in-person voting. We'll also doing things like making sure that election workers have personal protective equipment to keep themselves safe, and cleaning supplies to keep polls clean and sanitized. Currently, Congress has allocated $400 million to states. That's just a fraction of the $1.5 to $2 billion that's going to be needed. And if you're thinking about states that are going to have to move from serving maybe 2% or 3% of voters by mail in every prior election to needing to serve 50% or more voters by mail, that's such a significant increase in the number of people that they're serving by this method. And we've already talked about the ways that there has to be technology so that it's not an individual person stuffing, instead of a few dozen envelopes, literally hand stuffing thousands, if not millions of envelopes. You have to have that technology, and it does cost money. Not only does it cost money, but vendors who produce this technology are seeing demands beyond what they've ever seen before. And so they need lead time to be able to start the process of making sure this equipment is available, and then to actually begin the process that it takes to print these ballots and stuff these envelopes and get these request forms out. And so not only is it urgent that more funding is allocated to states, and that money not only makes it to states, it makes it to local election officials that are at the county and local level. But it's also urgent that funding is happening right now, because election departments need to be able to start working with vendors to get this equipment and to be making the orders that they will need for supplies for November. And they need time to be able to ramp up their systems. It can't happen overnight. And we're less than 200 days away from the election, so it needs to happen now.
Well, and so now that you mentioned that, I mean, what's that timetable like? I mean, if a jurisdiction really wants to do this and do this effectively, what's the drop dead date to really get that ball rolling?
You know, the timeline varies. It depends on, you know, the vendor and the quantity, but you know, many vendors are saying that they need this information by, you know, basically early summer at the latest. So we are really closing in on those timelines. A working group of government officials from the federal, state, and local level came together and basically record speed came out with a set of FAQs and timelines to help guide election officials in ramping up their processes around vote by mail. We're actually partnering with these folks to develop and deliver our webinars. And one of the first documents was this timeline that looks at all of the different processes in the lead up to an election. And several of them had dates that were, you know, as early as last week, where you need to get these things started.
Wow.
And so again, just can't underscore the urgency of the need for funding now, and for that funding to be getting into the hands of both state and local officials.
I know I asked you about states that are resistant, but have you encountered states and jurisdictions on the other end of the spectrum that hit you up? It's like, hey, what y'all got? We trying to get here. Can you help us? Have you seen an uptick in that type of communication?
We absolutely have seen a huge appetite. Now, you know, one thing I want to say is that while there is some sort of partisan resistance among legislators that we've heard around increasing vote by mail, there has not been any partisan divide among the election officials that are actually doing this work. There's been a great amount of unity among election officials, in the same way that the American public, there's no divide about what folks think needs to be available this fall. And so we've seen an outpouring of election officials who are really hungry to do this work right, and who know that they need support to do it effectively. So when we announced the opening of our trainings, we saw in the first week already nearly 250 signups to attend these trainings. And so we know that the demand is there. We know that election officials really want to do right by voters this fall, and that they're united around what it's going to take. And
that 250, I assume, was pretty spread out.
It was spread out coast to coast and places in between of election officials who really want to know, again, not only how to ramp up their operations, but also, you know, one of the core things that we're focused on is how to effectively communicate to the public about what their options are and how to navigate and demystify what's going to be a new voting method for a lot of people, so that people feel comfortable and confident in the process.
Yeah. You know, as you were saying that and thinking about those election officials, they're really kind of frontline workers themselves.
Yes.
Especially if they live in states that have not made the decision on mail-in.
That's right.
So if I'm an election official, and you know, this is the work I have to do. Nobody does this but me, not a legislator, not a governor, not a regular politician. And at the same time, I know I'm going to have to be bringing people in to vote, possibly handling ballots. That makes me a frontline person in a very contagious pandemic, doesn't it?
And let me add to that, you are probably for the first time having to navigate how to have your operations mostly in a work from home fashion. I'll add to that over 60% of the government officials that fill the role of election officials are within the age range of folks that are a high vulnerable population.
Yeah.
And so not only are they making considerations about how to respond to a massive moment in terms of voting, but they're realigning how they're doing their own work. They're supporting each other and their staff. And so, yeah, there's just a huge number of demands on them. In fact, the first thing that we're kicking off our series with is making sense of the moment is sort of the broad topic, but the first training is actually on how to support election officials, recognizing that these are humans that are doing incredible work for our country, incredible public service, and are just navigating so much. And I think the last thing I would add on this point is that, we were talking before about some of the resources it's going to take to be able to effectively administer an election this fall. If you're thinking about the processing side of this, so now we have a huge increase in just the amount of paper that is returned, right? Because now we're on mail ballots. Those then need to be counted and processed, but you also need to take social distancing potentially into account when you're actually doing that processing. So election officials are also going to be needing to look for real estate, warehouses that are large enough to have this increased amount of paper, and then the volunteer workers there spread out to be able to do this safely as well. So there's just so many considerations that are currently on the table for these officials to make. And they need support, they need funding to do it effectively.
So, Tiana, are you confident, optimistic that this can go the way it ought to go by November? What are your thoughts?
I am optimistic. Election officials, election administration is something that's chronically underfunded. The right to vote is so important, but it's a field that never really has the resources to do fully the work that voters deserve. And election officials already are being tremendously creative in being able to adapt the ways that they're serving voters. Some folks are, using drive-up windows that have been closed off in their offices for years to be able to process ballots, or partnering with local libraries to be able to convert book drops into drop boxes for ballots. Just being really tremendously resourceful. There's only so far creativity can get us. They shouldn't need to be that creative. They need the funding to be able to follow best practice when it comes to elections this fall. But I'm confident that if we act quickly and get election officials the resources that they need, that the will is there, that the know-how is there, the commitment to voters is there, and that we can make this happen. But it's going to take a concerted effort of a lot of actors, and it's going to take the right funding.
Tiana, what about security?
Mm-hmm.
There's also a concern considering what happened in 2016 and even with some elections after that. It's well documented that outside forces played a role,
mm-hmm.
and to some extent continue to do so and want to continue to do so. How does the Center for Tech and Civic Life address that? What advice does it give stakeholders in that?
Yeah, so following the 2016 election, when we convened our advisors and when we were out in the field at conferences of election officials, we were, gathering information about what were the most pressing topics for election officials as they debriefed 2016 and were preparing for tackling new election cycles. And the number one question we heard again and again, of course, was concerns about cybersecurity and needing to build their skills in that area. And so at the center, we partnered with the Center for Democracy and Technology and developed out a 3-part cybersecurity best practices training for election departments. And that has continued to be one of our most successful and widespread trainings that we've made available. Election officials, whether they're in a big city like here in Chicago, or if they're in a small town where there's just 2 election workers in their office, all need to still have a baseline set of skills to be able to protect our election systems. And so we make sure that election officials know, basic personal security habits, that they know the basic terminology around cybersecurity, that folks can make strong passwords and use 2-factor authentication. But we also make sure that election officials know some of the cybersecurity frameworks so that they're able to catalog their systems and have clear plans on how they will respond to or prevent any type of incursion. And then we also want to make sure that officials know how to really effectively communicate with the public about all of these things, because at the end of the day, voter confidence is what is really the most important. And so it's important that election officials are able to communicate with the public about what they're proactively doing to protect our election systems, and are able to fight through any misinformation that exists out in digital platforms. And so, really focused on all of those aspects so that officials have what they need to be able to defend against any sort of cyber incursions.
So in an ideal world, do you advocate us remaining paper or electronic, or is there a combination of both?
Yeah. In an ideal world, we think that there needs to be tools that make it easier for people to access the ballot box, but that there needs to be, when you actually are casting a ballot, a paper record that is a record that can be audited and confirmed that the vote that you cast was counted correctly. And so there are lots of ways that technology can make it easier for people to register, or essentially eliminate the need for registration by things like automatic voter registration that can happen at the DMV. There's ways that you can use technology more effectively, especially right now, and letting people request absentee or mail ballots. There's ways that we can use technology to audit the ballots on the back end to validate our results. But we are not currently in the business of advocating for actually voting using digital tools or technology, because we're not there.
Just not there. But you would advocate somewhere down the road, we ought to get there, right? I mean, shouldn't we be able, just to even use a phone and vote and still have a paper record, but just to make it even more accessible? Everybody's on their phone. My a good friend of mine, the late Dick Gregory, used to ask this question. He said, when we go to the ATM, and some of the people who make the ATM machines, like Debo, make the electronic voting machines, and he would say, Mark, when I put my card in the ATM, it never gives me $1 million more than I asked for. It's always accurate. Why can't it be that accurate when it comes to voting?
There's been, lots of experiments to date with mobile and online voting, and unfortunately, everyone has shown that we're not at a place where it's secure enough yet. I like the ATM and the banking analogy because it's something that we are all very familiar with, the ease and convenience of online banking. But one of the parts that we don't see is that there's a small percentage of sort of fraud on transactions that happen on the back end, and there's insurance baked in so that we don't have to deal with those losses, and the banks don't really have to deal with those losses. And you can have that little margin of error, right, in something like online banking with insurance, but there can't be a margin of error when it comes to voting. We have to be able to get it 100% right. And so until we're there, it's just not an option that should viably be on the table.
Well, hopefully we can get there one day. Folks, techandciviclife.org is the website to go to find out more. Very important work that Tiana Epps-Johnson and the center are doing. Thank you, Tiana. I think you're doing the Lord's work too. This is important. And it probably more important, and you're probably as busy, if not busy as you've ever been in 2020. So keep up the great work, and we're going to hope for the best, and I'll do my best to share your optimism, okay?
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you for joining us, all right?
All right.
All right.
Have a great rest of your
All
day.
right. Okay. All right, you too. Thank you for listening to Make It Plain and Get Woke. Remember to listen, like, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. If all minds are clear, it has been made plain.